Hello, everybody. I'm Natalie Brunell. Thank you so much for checking out my show, where I get to hear from the leading voices in Bitcoin, financial markets, political structures, philosophy, and more. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like this video so more people see it and hit that notifications button so you don't miss out on any new content. This podcast does not provide financial advice. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So make sure you always do your own research before making any financial decisions and be aware of your risk tolerance. I'm able to produce this show thanks to my sponsors, and I'm very picky about who I choose to partner with. So I hope you'll take the time to listen to the ad reads throughout the show. I'm also able to produce this show thanks to the support of my listeners and viewers, value for value. So if you'd like to make a donation to help the show grow, you can find my Bitcoin and Lightning wallets in the description. All right, now to my main partner, Swan Bitcoin. Swan is where I do all of my Bitcoin purchases. In fact, I dollar cost average every single day, not every week, not bi-monthly, every single day. And they have the lowest fees in the space. I love Swan Bitcoin because it is a true Bitcoin only company. Swan has a ton of free educational resources on their website, and they now have a mobile app, which I've been using to smash by some Bitcoin. And Swan Studios produces my new show, Hard Money, which covers the biggest news in Bitcoin and the global economy. It's like an orange-pilled version of CNBC, so make sure to check that out on YouTube for all the biggest headlines, because we are not afraid to question the mainstream narrative. All right, it's time for the show. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Coin Stories. And here with me today, I'm so excited to have Danielle DiMartino Booth. She's the CEO and Chief Strategist for Quill Intelligence, and she's also a global thought leader on monetary policy, economics, and finance. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here. My first time with you, Natalie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've seen you on Fox News, Fox Business News with Charles Payne a lot. So super excited to have you. And I want to start with your origin story, because that's how I start all my shows. And I read and heard that you have an Italian immigration story, which I'm really excited about because I used to live in Italy. I actually speak Italian. So I want to hear how your family made it from Italy to here.
Va bene. I speak fluent Spanish, which makes absolutely no sense. So in 1923, two brothers came across from Abruzzo, which is on the Adriatic, actually a pre-Roman town there. And there was so little work that in 1927, one of the two brothers went back, but my great-grandfather stayed, Gennaro DiMartino. And so his son came over when he was 2 years old to Ellis Island. He was quarantined with polio, and then came through and was the fifth of seven children. And I consider to be Grandpa DiMartino. They used to call him Jerry. Hey, Jer, the absolute epitome of the American immigrant dream. During World War II, they deployed him to Great Britain. And they trained him to be a mechanic. He actually never left England. And that really helped him perfect his English. And when he came back, he had a skill. So in outside of New Haven, Connecticut, he opened up one DiMartino Sunoco station on one side of I-95 and another on the other side of I-95 a few years later. So I consider my children to be fifth generation gearheads. We're all kind of car freaks. But my grandfather made it. He sent his children to university. And interestingly enough, even though it's a tremendous loss that his children did not speak Italian, I've always held my grandfather in such high standing, because I asked him before he died, I said, Grandpa, why did you teach none of the children Italian? And he said, well, America is such a great gift that we wanted to respect our newfound country. We wanted to respect her by learning her language. And it's just, there's nothing that I can say about my roots. And even on my mother's side, the German people who came over into Southern Texas, which is a whole different story. I'm the double product of immigrants, and I couldn't be more proud.
Wow. I mean, honestly, it almost makes me emotional when I hear this, because my family immigrated from Poland. I'm first generation. I was 5. And I've actually been traveling for work to Europe, and I've met some Polish people, and they kind of chuckle because I don't speak Polish very well. And they ask why. And it was the same thing. My mom and dad would speak Polish to me, but they didn't want me to go to Polish school. They wanted me to speak English because they were so proud that they came here. They wanted to learn the language and for me to be an English speaker first and foremost. So I feel for that whole story. Is there anything interesting on the German side and how both of your parents made it to Texas? Because that's where you grew up, right?
Well, since you asked, my mother grew up in South Texas, and she is a product of English and German immigrants to the United States. When the Vietnam War first broke out, being a poor girl from a small town, she ended up going and becoming a civil servant at Lackland Air Force Base, where to this day, all Air Force basic trainees still train through Lackland Air Force Base.
Wow.
My father in Connecticut had just started at the University of Connecticut. And he found out that his draft card was coming up. And like so many boys of that generation, rather than be drafted by the Army, he ran out to join the Air Force so that he didn't come home in a body bag. I grew up hearing this story. So he was sent to Lackland Air Force Base, where he did basic training. And they discovered in him a gift for teaching, a gift for being an instructor. So he was never, this is going to be too much story, more story than you ever wanted.
I really like this all. This is like part of my show, so go for it.
He was never deployed to Vietnam. He was released from the service when I was 2.5 months old. Mother continued working for the civil service. She actually worked in the disability division of Social Security and taught me about the dangers of living off the state from a very young age, because she would make these disability decisions at 37-year career. But when I was 2.5 months old, my father was released from the service, went back to Connecticut. People are always like, where's your thick Texas accent? I'm like, well, 2.5 months to 4.5 years was in Connecticut. Dad finished up at UConn. Wow. And then I moved back to Texas. One final thing, my father befriended a French Air Force pilot when he was, who'd come over to Lackland. And my mother was carrying me like a basketball. So they decided to name their son, Daniel Rene, after him. Oh. And when I was born, I was decidedly a girl. So they just added an E to both sides. And so I was Danielle Renee DiMartino. Wow. So that's a little more background than I've ever given. So
I love it. Okay. Well, so growing up in Texas with a little stint in Connecticut, I'm a little bit curious. What was your relationship with money? I would assume that you guys were you guys middle class? Were you kind of thinking about what you wanted your career to be when you were young and maybe wanted to work in the financial space?
So actually, and this is all documented in Fed Up. We were upper middle class. However, my father had a penchant for debt, and that really landed the family in trouble over the years. I did actually, instead of play dolls, I used to play office, and I used to have my office set up in front of me. But I promised that I would never go into economics or finance, which my father taught until his dying day in 2003, died very young. In fact, I just met one of his students who said it's maiden name DiMartino. Vince DiMartino, greatest teacher ever. So, but I promptly went into finance, started my career on Wall Street, and now I'm considered to be one of the foremost macroeconomists with an expertise in monetary policy. Go figure, Dad. So
amazing. Yeah, I saw you went to the University of Austin, but then you also have an MS in journalism from Columbia.
Well, sometimes when you're really successful on Wall Street, you end up putting yourself in the corner, which I did. So I was spending too much going out at night, and my shoe budget was, I was enjoying
shoe
life.
Budget.
Oh, my shoe budget was awful. So I sent myself back to school. I'd always had a dream of getting a master's in journalism, specifically from Columbia. So I called up Red McCombs, who my business school at University of Texas is named the McCombs School of Business. He was one of the people who wrote me a letter of recommendation to Columbia, and I ended up being a night student. So the stock market would close. I would rush across town to the 1 and 3, go up to the West Side and take night classes at Columbia. I was probably their oldest part-time student ever, and graduated in December of 01. I was in school during 9/11.
Wow. Wow. Well, I mean, no wonder you're so polished and eloquent when you go on the news. I see you on Fox Business. I've seen you at conferences. You're a wonderful speaker, and you're able to take very complex topics that someone without a financial background like myself can really understand. So it must be from that. But speaking of 9/11, I I think that you were you at Credit Suisse for your early career as well? Were you kind of working through some of these previous financial crises and learning a lot about what happens before the Federal Reserve?
So I was actually at Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette. We were acquired by Credit Suisse.
Okay.
It was a very bad acquisition. The beauty of being at DLJ, though, was I was in a bank where there was a massive merchant bank. And so the denizens of private equity walked the halls. Leon Black, Tony Gray sold the firm at the top of the internet bubble. I kind of got to see the invisible hand of the Fed feeding bubbles. Didn't know what it was, though. At the time, you just knew that there was some force that was distorting valuations. But at the same time, again, I was in a world of private equity before it was a big thing. Now you think of the non-bank financial sector, the non-banking system at the end of 2020 was $227 trillion globally.
Wow.
And the conventional banking system globally was $180 trillion. So to think that this cottage industry, and obviously it's more than private equity, but to think that the non-banking system today dwarfs the size of the conventional banking system. And we wonder why there's so little regulation and so many things that go wrong. It's because the non-banks are bigger than the banks.
Okay, so I want to hear how you ended up at the Dallas Fed, but before that, if you could, tap yourself on the shoulder when you were working on Wall Street and give yourself the biggest lesson that you learned, when you were just starting out. What's the big lesson and takeaway that you wish you would have told a younger Danielle?
So, two things. I always tell younger people to start off in sales because it's the hardest thing you will ever do. So you may as well do it when you're young and you've got a lot of energy and you can handle rejection. It fortifies you for what the rest of the world brings, regardless of what industry you go into. Mm-hmm. And I would say, second to that, never, ever get sold. Always push back internally if you feel as if somebody who would be your superior is trying to sell you something like a collateralized mortgage obligation that makes absolutely no sense. And they're saying, just put your clients into it. It's money good. Working around high yield debt and what have you. Never get sold anything internally, even if you're an employee. That always bode well for me in my career. Always do your homework, always do your own due diligence. If it doesn't pass the sniff test, that's because it's rotten.
Well, there must be something that really taught you that, and especially about the kind of greater environment of banking and its relationship with the Fed. Could you pinpoint what that is? I
mean, this was, I once asked the natural gas analyst why he wasn't budging on his price target for Enron, even though I couldn't make heads or tails of the business model. Mm-hmm. Little did I know, going on in the background, all those investment banking fees were being churned and deals being done in the background and effectively people's souls being sold. So you always understand that money is the ultimate motivator, especially when something doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Typically, when everything comes down, and whatever the facade is shattered, you find out that behind it was pure and simple greed.
Yep. Well, we're learning that right now with this whole FTX blowout in the crypto world, which maybe we'll touch on a little bit later. But how did you end up working for the Fed in Dallas?
So I mentioned those collateralized mortgage obligations. I had sniffed out that there was something that was simply not kosher about them. When I left Wall Street to move to Dallas to become a mom, I signed a non-compete. I agreed to leave the industry, sold my book of business directly back to the junk bond desk. I'd done a lot of debt retirements in my time. Imagine 13 and 5/8 coupons, just pulling those puppies out of secondary trading and retiring them for big corporations. But I sold my book of business back to the bank and agreed to leave the industry, called the publisher of the Dallas Morning News, told him that I was in retirement and that I would work for free. And he said that would work great with my budget, as a matter of fact.
Why? So, why did you want to do that?
I was retired. I always wanted to just write about the markets. Okay. When I retired, and as far as I knew, I was retired. One day I got an email from Warren E. Buffett, and I said, well, that's interesting. I'm writing about the housing bubble, its potential to be global and systemic in nature. And, this massive bubble that would reach far beyond U.S. shores. And
this was like 06, 07?
This was 04. 2005.
Whoa.
So, I was also writing about the potential implications long-term of letting the Chinese buy so many US treasuries, and how that might or might not be resolved one day when we were a lot older. And it ended up not being spam. It ended up being an email from Warren Buffett saying, "You're writing great things about this country. Come to Omaha." And so I did.
Wow.
It was great. I got to spend a lot of time with Charlie Munger, and so enjoyed that. And then a few months later, Richard Fisher, who was the newly installed president at the Dallas Federal Reserve, called and said, "Come have lunch." And I did. We got to talking. The running joke inside the Fed was that they hired me to shut me up because I was writing all of these crazy things. Hadn't I heard Ben Bernanke say it was sustained? And why didn't I just take the man's word for it? So I ended up doing some seminal work in the subprime mortgage industry while I was inside the Fed, and becoming one of Richard's closest advisors throughout the crisis. It was an incredible experience, but that's how I got to the Fed.
We're going to take a quick break from the show to hear these messages from my sponsors. First up, iTrustCapital. Do you save in Bitcoin for your retirement in your IRA? iTrustCapital allows you to invest in Bitcoin and other digital assets with the tax benefits of an IRA. And unlike the stock market, you can buy and sell 24 hours a day. Instead of paying taxes on Bitcoin gains every year, you can defer taxes using an iTrust crypto IRA, or with an iTrustCapital Roth IRA, you can withdraw tax-free at retirement. iTrust recently hit a milestone of $6 billion in total transactions across the platform, and that's $6 billion in tax-advantaged accounts that those 87,000 new IRS agents can't do anything about. The iTrustCapital platform is easy to use and only takes a few minutes to set up. And if you want to start investing with a $100 bonus, head to iTrust.capital/Natalie Brunell. Next up, let's talk about Bitcoin 2023. That is the biggest Bitcoin conference in the world. And take a look at the video from last year in Miami. It was an incredible event that was jam-packed with the best speaking sessions, workshops, and networking events that I've been to in the space. I had the chance to live anchor the Bitcoin Magazine news desk and serve as MC. And it was such a full circle moment for me to be at that conference, because the first one I attended was Bitcoin 2021 in Miami. And that's where I actually launched the Coin Stories podcast. I went on a media pass because I used to be a reporter, and I actually went backstage and started asking the speakers like Michael Saylor and Preston Pysh if they would come on my show. And they did. And a year later, I'm back at the conference as someone who actually has a career now in Bitcoin. So you never know what can happen at these events. I highly recommend going so you can meet other people that share the same values and passion for Bitcoin. And if you want your ticket at a 10% discount, head to b.tc/conference and use the code HODL, HODL. I'll see you there.
But that's how I got to the Fed.
Wow. Well, okay. So working for the president, you saw the housing bubble implode, and your book is called Fed Up. I mean, you are now a critic of the Federal Reserve once again. And so can you talk a little bit about the lessons learned that maybe can really be applied today with this latest bubble, and the fact that we've kicked the can up to the sovereign level now, and we're about to hit what most analysts say will be a major recession. And, the working class, the people, our background, I feel like is very similar. Like the working class is hit the most because they're working harder and harder for dollars worth less and less. And at some point, they just have to print. So what is the sorts of things that you learn that you really want the average person to know?
So, when we're talking about crippling inflation, we had crippling inflation in a way back in the aftermath, and even leading up to the Great Financial Crisis. But policymakers, statisticians, they were measuring it improperly. So asset price inflation is very much a real phenomena. When you think of 10 million plus homes lost to foreclosures in the aftermath, those are 10 million families who lost their homes. They were taught to buy into this speculative bubble, and they were reassured that inflation wasn't a thing because it was being measured improperly, insufficiently measured. And at the end of massive internal staff papers and debates, and gee, we missed that bubble, and how did that happen? The Fed decided to do nothing. They didn't change the inflation metric that they followed. And I got really mad. and started planning on this book that I was going to write called Fed Up. So you don't recognize a problem and then choose to do nothing about it. Because if that happens, then you'll stumble into the same situation again where you're proactively inflating bubbles because
Right.
you don't recognize asset price inflation and what a zero interest rate environment brings about in a nefarious way.
Well, my parents were two of those 10 million Americans. We lost our house in the great financial crisis, which probably in some way has led me to where I am and looking into all of this. And obviously from my angle of, is Bitcoin a solution? But, if you were responsible for some of these, for the decisions made after the bubble burst for housing, what would you have done? Where did they go wrong? Should we have bailed out the banks? What would you have done in that seat?
No, I don't think the banks should have been bailed out. I think the banks, as my mentor, Lacey Hunt, would suggest, I think the banks should have gone to the discount window and that they should have worked out what was good collateral, what was bad collateral, and let the chips fall where they may and let the banks fail if need be. Now, you can't pick and choose. You can't say, there goes Bear, there goes Lehman, I'm going to save AIG. That puts moral hazard into hyperdrive. When you make decisions, like when you allocate credit, when you say who the winners and the losers are within the financial system that corrupted the Fed, that it was already corrupt. So, but I do think that the banks should have been allowed to fail. I think that had there been better regulation of the mortgage industry in 2003, when Alan Greenspan was approached, and sir, we've got this big, we've got all of this lending going on in the subprime mortgage market. People are buying homes they don't qualify for. This could be very problematic. And Greenspan's response was, well, the Federal Reserve only technically regulates 25% of all mortgage lending, and therefore it's not our problem. And he looked the other way. Had macroprudential regulations come down the pipeline, limiting to those who were truly qualified the ability to gain access to mortgage lending, this would not have ended the way it did. And we wouldn't be where we are today, because all we did in the aftermath of that mortgage market imploding was resolve an over-indebtedness problem by creating more debt yet.
Yes. Yes. Let me ask you, because this is something I think about all the time when I see the current Fed officials on camera talking about, this cycle and inflation and trying to tighten. Are they acting out of ignorance, or are they completely, just dishonest, just deceit? Is it ignorance? Is it malice?
So I think that right now that there are two camps, and there are two distinct camps of Federal Reserve officials right now. There are some who've been deceived and realized that the academics' models were fatally flawed, and feel as if they have been they've had a done wrong to them. I speak of the not so academics there. And then there are others who blatantly continue to agree blindingly with their theories. And it's not so much if you were to ask them the same question, these are the people who are dovish, who are saying we should step back, we shouldn't be fighting inflation, who would knowingly step back into the den of thieves of quantitative easing and zero interest rate policy. If you ask them, I think that they would actually believe that they're right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there is a certain indescribable hubris among academics that is the most irritating thing you can ever imagine. There was a lot of politicking going on inside of the Fed. Most people don't appreciate that. And while there's a power struggle at the top of any structure, a lot of times there's paralysis. Mm-hmm. And the transitory narrative was emblematic of the paralysis and of the fact that there were two people vying for the leadership position at the Fed, which divided the staff.
Wow.
In the aftermath, yes, he was led down the wrong path, but the egg was on Jay Powell's face. He's the one who bought into it. He had to own up to it. Mm-hmm. And now he's pissed.
Right.
So did he do things in the aftermath of the pandemic to make things worse? Could we call it crony capitalism? Sure. Is he sincere now in saying he wants to slay this beast? Guy's worth $150 million. He doesn't need the job at all. And if you've ever seen him on screen, he does not come across as a little Hitler or somebody on a huge power trip. Not his MO. He's a humble guy. So why be there? Unless you feel that you've become part of an organization that is at the root of destroying America, and you maybe want to try and do something about it by finally standing up to the academics running the world's largest economy and finally allowing the chips to fall where they may, allow a credit cycle to take hold and play out.
Wow. I want to come back to that and just seeing Jay Powell, some of the things that he said. But first, going back to what you mentioned about letting the banks fail. Do you say that because in a sense, our current economy, it's almost like a drug addict, right? We've puffed it up. You get your big high and there's a lag effect with that and it feels all great. But then when you take away the drugs, the withdrawal sets in, and that is very, very, very painful. But obviously economists, especially on the Austrian side, would argue that that's what's needed to, cleanse out the excess in the system. And it will be painful and banks would fail and there would be unemployment, but it would be actually shorter. We would have short-term pain, maybe very, very deep, a deflationary bust, another really, really big depression, but actually in the long run, it would be better and it would allow the economy to sort of stabilize itself. Is that why you believe that?
So, Jim Grant has done beautiful work in this arena. He has studied closely the depression of 1920-21. That was truly a depression. GDP declined to that great of an extent. The bad credits were expunged from the system, and on we went to the roaring 20s.
There was no intervention.
There was no intervention. So there is precedent. There is indeed precedent. And this was at a time, by the way, I looked all the way back into the archives of the Federal Reserve, and in the very early 1920s, there were bad banks that did have to go to the discount window. Mm-hmm. It's hard. It's going out of business is difficult. Mm-hmm. But if you make bad loans, you pay the price, or at least you did more than 100 years ago in America. Mm-hmm. So the Austrians are correct. The question today becomes one of what that depression would look like, because the stakes are so high.
Right. Because they've kicked the can down the road so much. They didn't let it unwind. Yeah.
And it is inevitably and always the little guy who suffers the most.
Yeah.
And seeing that through. All of this being said, we're talking about non-banks and banks. If the regular banking system is impaired, mm-hmm. the non-banks have no exit route. Mm-hmm. There's no junk bond market. There's no IPOs. There's no mergers. There's no acquisitions. There's no way to keep the non-banking system alive mm-hmm. if you impair the banking system. That to me would be the greater victory.
Wow. Well, when you look back at the last, I would say 40 or so years, we had this secular bull market and we saw interest rates get down to zero, ZERP. Now you're saying that Jerome Powell might be the leader of a new regime, right? Who's trying to fix some of these systemic problems. Can you explain to people from all your experience and your perspective from working at the Fed, what that did really to the working class? Because right now, millennials and the generations that came after, they're frustrated. To me, it's literally no surprise that they're trying to escape the legacy system. They're trying to build this new one in crypto, and they just want a seat at the table. And they want to be able to somehow afford a house and their vacations and their avocado toast and all of that. And I just want to get your take on, from a macro level as a society, where we got to, because now we're more polarized and divided, and we have these populist uprisings happening. And it's no surprise because the wealthier have gotten so wealthy and the mm-hmm. poor have gotten so poor.
And you're right. And who are the wealthiest among the wealthy? These are the people who run the non-banks of the world. They don't get paid what a CEO gets paid. They get paid 10, 20 times that. And they really do sit at the very, very top of what has gone wrong. Inequality run off the rails. I would say this. This is a generation that in so many ways needs a solution. And I think part of that solution is going to be grounded in ditching the nihilism. You have to get rid of it's us against them. You have to let young leaders come up by way of true grit and hard work, not quite quitting. There has to be an embracing of what made Jerry DiMartino an American dream.
Yeah.
Working your ass off. There has to be, it can't be, we need our payback because we've suffered. It has to be, we're going to go get it.
Yeah, I love that. As opposed to entitlement, motivation to just compete, innovate, and drive forward.
Yes, yes, and yes, absolutely.
Well, so how do we get there? I mean, because right now everyone's feeling the pain, right? And they're trying to tighten. We have so much debt in the system. The conclusion by most people that I hear from in this space is, well, it's going to be painful. Maybe it'll last a year, a couple of years, but in the end, they have to print. Maybe there's this huge capitulation moment. Boom, the printer has to go again because that's the only way we inflate our debt away. So what's going to happen? How do you see this playing out over the next couple of years?
So, I mean, we're at a major turning point in U.S. history, and we've got octogenarians running the show. It's time for a JFK. Maybe it's Ron DeSantis. I really don't care who it is. We need a new generation of leadership in Washington, D.C. It has to start with leadership. It has to start with changing the Constitution, which is something you can do if you can get 2/3 of the states to agree to term limits. So we never fall down this rabbit hole again. So that we make sure that the politicians who are working on our behalf, they don't have anything to lose. They just need to do their job because they know that they're going to leave after a set number of years. And that is when you have somebody like a Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania stand in the way of so many different forms of corruption in the financial system because he knew he was leaving. He ran on term limits and he's leaving in January based on that term limit. And we have so few examples of politicians who agree to the job and do the job because they know that the job is going to end. And only if it ends is it going to be a means by which to serve. But again, this is something that can be changed with we forget that we have the Constitution. We bitch and moan on voters, on election day. There's a way for the people to come and change the laws of the country, amend the Constitution. These are things that can be done. It's a grassroots effort, though. You say, how do we do this? One door at a time, one millennial at a time, one Gen Xer at a time. God knows people in my generation are tired of the boomers, exhausted of them and what they've done, because it's affecting our children's pathway. 18, 16, 14, and 14, my kids. I'm kind of happy they're in school right now. Let's wait this puppy out. Hopefully we get young leadership in between and you can come into a workforce that's a better place. But it has to be a grassroots effort.
We're going to take another quick break to hear these messages from my sponsors. First up, Fold. Fold is the best Bitcoin rewards debit card and shopping app in the world. You can earn Bitcoin on everything you purchase, from Amazon to your groceries, with Fold's Bitcoin cashback debit card, and win free Satoshis every day, or even a whole Bitcoin by spinning the daily wheel and the purchase rewards wheels. I actually have an alarm set every single day so that I never miss out on spinning the daily wheel and earning free sats. And, I have to say that Fold is one of the best ways to get someone completely new into Bitcoin because they can start earning it and learning about it and using it. So if you want to sign up and join the fun, head to foldapp.com/Natalie for 5,000 in free sats. All right, now I want to tell you about a company called CrowdHealth, which is a Bitcoin-enabled alternative to health insurance. Because let's be honest, the government and insurance companies have jacked up prices. They've made things super complex. And when you send your money in, it essentially goes into the health insurance black hole, and then you never see it again, even if you don't get sick and you don't need medical services because, you don't eat fiat foods. But then if you actually do get sick or you need care, you have to send them more money because something ends up not being covered. The great news is there's now an alternative brought to you by Bitcoiners, and it is called CrowdHealth. It is very different from insurance. Instead of sending your hard-earned money to an insurance company, you hold your money in an account that CrowdHealth helps you set up. And you can even convert the dollars in your account to Bitcoin. Now, the company is all about community. Remember, it's called CrowdHealth. So when someone in the community is in need, needs care, needs help, you can choose to actually use the money in your account to help them, or you can keep it in your account. And if you ever leave CrowdHealth, you can take the money that's left with you. If you want to learn more and sign up, you can head to joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie. Now back to the show. Well, I think it's going to be really an interesting clash, and I feel like we're on the brink of sort of revolution because the incentive system is so broken, and it really does continue to benefit the people that are closest to the monetary spigot. And going back to what you said earlier about inflation, it's one of the things that I've really learned about and examined over the last couple of years is this idea that we need inflation because that's the only thing that sustains our system based on credit, and we need it to inflate away our debt. And we are now in a world where productivity and technology drive prices down. This is something author Jeff Booth talks about, but yet prices we see are going constantly up in the form of our real estate and in equities. And no one would vote for a system where your house is falling down in value, right? And we've also managed to make some nice tax deals by deferring things to a 401k, and that fluffs up the stock bubble as well. I mean, how do you transition from a system like that to something else that maybe has something a little bit more sound, maybe some hard money at the foundation? Because this one is full of manipulation and distortion. And on the other side, I mean, it could be a very painful transition if we try.
It indeed could be. And that's why I have my hope in Jay Powell. And, I am the first person to say, if it's unfounded, it's unfounded. But what if he's trying to get the terminal rate to 5% so that it only ever goes back to 2%? So that we say goodbye, adios, amigo, to 0%. To the zero bound. Just get rid of it. Get rid of quantitative easing. If you start to rewind the clock, take the rules of engagement back to where they were when Paul Volcker was in office, who didn't give a damn about the financial markets. If you do that, it has to be one step at a time. If he cannot accomplish this, then I think you're right. I think the chances are rising daily of a revolution. One way or another, though, we're going to get there. Mm-hmm. And if there is a revolution, by the way, I doubt that at the end of it, they would say, look, there's a bunch of 90-year-olds. They're still waiting to get their jobs back. No, one way or another, you're going to come up with young leadership.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I talk about obviously on this show is Bitcoin, because there's clearly a problem. Bitcoiners think that Bitcoin could potentially be a solution because it's a digital version of hard money. We used to be on the gold standard. Now we're just looking for a way to basically recalibrate the economy and make it so that money is separated from the state, which is a very, very big ambition, right? What is your take on Bitcoin?
So it's that last part of it that you mentioned, going back to the fall of Rome and the idea of sovereignty, the idea of countries stepping back, being told to step back. Economies will continue to be economies. Countries will continue to be countries. If one falls, one will rise. I don't foresee a world in which there's not an economic superpower. If there's an economic superpower, then there's an entity that's in control of the world's reserve currency. I wrote the book on being pissed off at people who trash the value of the dollar. I wrote it. I'm there. I don't empathize. I am it. I'm too great of a study of the history of the world to believe that a revolution in the United States wouldn't be seen as another country as a great opportunity to rise to the fore and let the United States fall. You see it all the time with Chinese headlines. China's been very, very critical of US monetary policy. Wrap your head around that. A communist regime is critical of a capitalist society's monetary policy, and they worry about all the profligacy, and they sure as hell don't want that to happen in China. That sounds to me like a country that is ready to rise. It sounds to me like the idea that the United States is going to implode upon itself, devour itself, go down in revolution, have neighbor fight neighbor, and in doing so, lose its status in the world and allow another country to rise. Will there be a hot war there? Probably.
You know, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because I immediately think of this recent report. I think 60 Minutes did it, but I had also read it elsewhere of what China's doing with TikTok, right? And they're changing the algorithms depending on which country. They're making it so that if you guys aren't aware of it, young people in China are exposed to math and science and things that are very technical and the things that teach them things. The young
TikTok
children
turns off after 40 minutes.
There you go.
And the only material on their TikTok is in museums. It's the next stage of science. It's only things that we think that we want our children to learn when they're doing everything you don't want them to do on TikTok. It's by design. I think that's what I'm trying to say, Natalie. You have to have other powers that be agree to go away quietly into the night and not be enemies of the state.
Yeah, and it was really interesting to see that and how they're basically enriching their children's brains with knowledge. Whereas here, it's the vegetables there. Here, it's the candy, and it's super addictive. And you're getting hit with dopamine with all these ridiculous videos that show really stupid behavior, but somehow, you know, you want to keep watching more. And, you know, I think that that's terrible for our young generations. And, you know, one thing could be said about you can invade a country with weapons. You can also invade them with ideas in a way that's much more sneaky and, you know, comes up and all of a sudden you have a movement and you have a weak society that can't even defend itself.
You are exactly 150% right. People ask me all the time, Danielle, why on earth would you torture your children and send them off to military academy in the middle of Indiana, in the middle of a cornfield on a lake? Well, they have a devices policy. They have discipline.
I love that.
The sophomore boys, my daughter attends as well. You know, when they're sophomores, they're up at 6 a.m. They're blowing the cannon off to wake up the campus. They're in uniform.
That's awesome.
They clean their rooms. They clean themselves. And they're limited in terms of their screen time. You have to be purposeful in parenting.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a working parent and you're traveling all around the planet like I am and really don't recognize what your weaknesses are, but don't let your children, don't plug your children in and then walk away and think nothing's going to come of it. Because you want a better world, not just for your own children, but for their children as well.
Right. Well, I think that rules and discipline actually help build character and build confidence. And it's interesting because even though this was culturally very different from my peer group when I was young, but I don't believe that a parent needs to be a child's best friend. I think maybe later in life that can happen and you have more of a friendship, but I think the parent needs to be the parent, the disciplinarian, and lays down the rules as opposed to, you know, letting them do whatever they want. I don't think that creates healthy boundaries and a healthy adult, but I'm just opining here, but
no, it doesn't. I mean, people ask me all the time, when you're gone one day, whether it's tomorrow or in 40 years, and what do you want to leave behind? And my stock answer is financially independent children who've learned from consequences growing up. And they can take care of themselves.
But hey, our country doesn't learn from the consequences of our actions. So going back to something you said about global reserve currency, Jerome Powell, I believe it was last year, said there can be more than one global reserve currency. I want to get your take on why you believe he said that, especially in the geopolitical context of countries that are really starting to de-dollarize, including China, including Russia, who they're developing a BRICS system, right? So you mentioned the US dollar, but why two global reserve currencies? What does that mean? And how does it play into the larger picture of all these super nations?
Jay Powell's also given lip service to the idea of a central bank digital currency, while all the while in the background, he's negotiating with the biggest banks to digitize currency, making sure that CBDC never exists. God love him for being a patriot. So, I think he says certain things, but I also, by the same token, when you see how he has comported himself, given the dollar being the wrecking ball that it is, and standing his position and saying, I understand that we're a global player. We make monetary policy for the United States. I mean, for 30 years, Ben Bernanke would have sooner, Yellen, none of his predecessors would have said such a thing. So I've never heard him make the comment about there being two reserve currencies. I don't think he's that wet behind the ears. I don't think he's that naive. When you asked me about Wall Street and being at DLJ, and it was always cute to me when there was a big merger or an acquisition announced, and there would be co-CEOs, and I'd be like, let's see how that lasts. And eventually, whoever was the dominant would kick the other out. But in order to get the merger done, there'll be a co-CEO situation. Two people in one C-suite doesn't work. Typically, there's always a winner and then a runner-up. By example, go see British pound currency.
Yeah.
British pound sterling, and where it was when it went completely off the rails in debt and lost itself.
No, it's interesting. I mean, that co-CEO analogy and the ultimate fate of that kind of relationship is interesting to me. But Bitcoiners have obviously, they wondered, like, does Jerome Powell have some sort of ulterior plan with Bitcoin? But
No.
You're like, no. Okay, well, let me ask you about, raising rates in the backdrop of how much debt we have, because we have interest payments that we need to meet before our other obligations. And really, I talk to so many analysts in the space who say, like, good luck, keep tightening. You'll be able to do it for maybe 3 more months, maybe 6 more months. If you're lucky, maybe another year. And then boom, you're going to spark a deflationary bust to which you're going to have to print more than ever. Some analysts are expecting, inflation to result in double digits, which obviously we haven't seen since the 1970s or 80s. What's your response to that? How do you see this actually happening as he raises rates?
So, first of all, the United States, whether it was by design or by mistake, the average maturity of the debt's now 72 months. So we're not in as precarious a position as you would think that we were. And that actually gets to Jay Powell's maintaining that he's going to get rates up and keep them there, because that's your biggest test when those T-bills start to roll. So thank heavens, I guess, for the United States that our maturity is longer than most people see it as being. That said, there's an analogy to be drawn here that CD overnight rates, companies are having a hard time financing their operating expenses using debt because short rates are so high. So when it does come time for the next potential stimulus bill to be considered, they'll have a lot more interest expense competing with the ability to just willy-nilly create new forms of stimulus. And thank God for that. That's why I hope he gets rates up and keeps rates up, because it puts a seatbelt on Congress and their ability to just create more stimulus. We have to have governors. We have to have binding constraints. And if it's interest rates that managed to stay up for a little while longer than, anybody alive remembers, fine.
But with fiscal stimulus, isn't that inflationary if they start handing out money or giving it to projects that, I mean, obviously we need to build infrastructure. We need CapEx, especially for energy, but isn't that all still inflationary?
It is, but I'll turn the question back on you. Do you think a GOP-led House of Representatives is going to pass some AOC dream?
No, I don't.
I don't either.
I just think it's going to be interesting because as people get more and more crushed, right? Especially given the response in the pandemic, they're going to want help. And going back to what we said earlier about this idea of hard work, what's unfortunate about a lot of people within the American public, and it's not all their fault, but like there's this feeling of entitlement, like, hey, I can't work, or, I can't find a job. Send me money. Like, I need to survive. What am I going to do? I'm owed it. And so do you see any of that happening as employment numbers start to tick up? And are you one of the people that thinks, yes, we are on the brink of a potentially really, really bad recession. And it's just that lagging effect that hasn't kicked in. I think you've compared it to shots of alcohol like I have.
Yep. I do think that. And, we don't understand that many states, if you're receiving severance, don't allow you to apply for unemployment insurance. That's one of the reasons we're seeing initial jobless claims be so well behaved. It's because unlike most labor cycles, this one's starting at the top of the income ladder. With people making $100,000, $150,000 a year, they're getting paid severance for a few months. They're not legally able. State of California being the exception, ... of course, period. But in many states, you cannot apply for unemployment insurance until you wait out your severance pay from the company. I tell you what, I'm gonna give you an example of somebody in your generation who helped me get my kids had their trade-in value for their iPhones was, he said, if it could have been negative, it would have been negative. I mean, they were glitching and everything was shattered. Yeah. You couldn't hear on one of them. You couldn't see on the other one. And he's like, lady. And I'm like, well, I told him I had to wait for years. So anyways, I get to talking to him. Very energetic, bright kid. I'm like, what are you doing working in an Apple store? I mean, what are you, 30? And he's like, no, I'll be 40 next year. And I've just been accepted to a nursing program. Do you know what they're making, these traveling nurses? And I'm like, as a matter of fact, I do know what they're making. He's like, I'll have job security for life. And I'm like, you damn straight will. Go get your nursing degree and go get a good profession. Go get your financial security and look me up. And that's a success story. That is somebody with their ear to the ground in the middle of a pandemic going, traveling nurses are getting like $5,000 a day. I can make potloads of money in this profession. Somebody who was like, you know what? We don't have enough water in this country. Maybe I'll be the next desalinization guru. Go for it.
Wow.
Make it happen. Because water is going to be more powerful than oil one day.
Wow.
Pay attention to what is happening around you and discover and exploit the opportunities.
Right.
Don't be entitled.
Right. Well,
entitle yourself.
I love that. And it really is interesting because there are so many people now. I think the statistics on like 30+ year olds who are living with their parents or, trying to start over, it is really sad. I mean, that's not representative of what American, capitalism really stands for. And, I'm curious so if Powell is able to get the terminal rate to 5% and that's the idea, right? That now it's not going to go back down to 0. It'll maybe go to 2. And maybe if it, but do you really think that that's possible with the amount of debt that we have without creating some sort of scenario that leads to contagion and we have this deflationary bust? There are people also who say that, there's a plan in place that you mentioned the CBDC before. There are, I think, 12 banks or so that are working with the New York Fed right now on a pilot program to test a digital dollar. And there's this idea of the reset. They want to reset. I think WEF has it on their website. This idea of a financial reset. There's going to be a central bank digital currency. I mean, what do you predict is going to happen as the rates rise and we have this new regime, but our economy is literally on quicksand because of the debt that it has?
So one of the 12 or so banks working with the New York Fed, the head of MasterCard, I believe it was, said, this is great because it takes CBDC out of the discussion. And I'm like, yes, it does. The people who are the great resetters on my Twitter feed at around 3 a.m., they're not going to catch on to what this means. And it means that the big banks are not going to step back from this digitization opportunity. They're going to be right front and center there using customer deposits as they would. They're just going to come into this century. God bless them. Bye-bye CBDC. So, but to answer the bigger question you're asking is, what if he gets the terminal rate up there and nothing systemic happens? What if one by one, the zombies are finally put to death? Goodbye. You're absolutely dead. No junk bond market's going to reopen to keep you alive. We're going to let you go out of business. Schumpeter's going to come back from the dead. Von Mises is going to be right there with them. Creative destruction is going to be alive and well. We're going to make room for all these great millennials and the generations behind them to start up new enterprises and create employment machines. Bring it, baby. Because that's what's going to happen if Jay Powell gets the terminal rate up, keeps it up, and nothing systemic happens. One piece of garbage business model company after another goes away.
I mean, there's like clouds and unicorns and rainbows floating all over the screen now because, I mean, no one believes that that's possible. But
you haven't had systemic risk yet? This is the most aggressive tightening campaign since 1980.
Yeah, the fastest. Yeah. Well, so what are you seeing? Because, we mentioned the lagging indicators and we'll start to wrap up soon. But the unemployment is expected to tick up. You've been talking about, it's interesting to know your mechanic background because you talk a lot about auto loans and car prices. So we are seeing these indicators. So, what happens if we have a major recession? Won't they need to step in and print? And if it prints, won't things moon?
Possibly. But I think that this particular GOP could cut off its nose to spite its face and want a pound of flesh for at least a year. If we're already in recession, a year is a long time before you hit the relief valve for this repossession massive wave, for people losing their cars, for people's credit cards blowing up and having to move back in with their families. Again, politics cannot be just kind of conveniently taken out of the equation. If this GOP is as revenge driven as they seem like they're going to be after the last 2 years of whatever the Inflation Acceleration Act was, all that stuff, if they're determined to take revenge for that, then we could be in recession with nobody doing anything about it until they go, oh my God, there's a 2024 election coming up. We're going to get voted out of office by a bunch of really pissed off people who want more debt forgiveness. This is why I think that Joe Biden has already announced an 8th suspension of financial student loan payments as of January the 1st. 8th. I tweeted it out this morning. I'm like, why don't we just quit playing games here? Why don't you just extend it until November of 2024? And it's the last hurrah. It's the last bit of gimme that you can give it away until November the 2024 and quit telling people they're going to get $20,000 in the mail. Move on.
It's so interesting to me looking at it from the vantage point of just how broken our money is. The fact that people, vote in one guy and they're like, oh, well, it's still not getting better. Things are bad. Let's just do the other guy. Okay, wait, things are not better. They're worse. Okay, let's go back to the other guy. And it's just this like ping pong. And meanwhile, the politicians are just getting richer off of it. And so I kind of wanted to, I'm kind of curious. What are your thoughts? Like,
Nancy Pelosi's got an ETF. She's got a damn ETF, Nancy Pelosi.
I know. Wait, okay. So who in your opinion actually runs this country? Politicians, corporations, or banks?
Lobbyists.
For which one?
They all have lobbyists.
Okay.
The corporations and the banks all pay the politicians.
Both of them. Yeah, but both of them. So the
whoever's
corporate
writing
lobbies or the bank lobbies.
And who's the biggest corporate lobby? I think it's Amazon. I think Amazon's the biggest corporate lobbyist. There's a list of them. They really don't want you to see the list, but it exists.
Yeah,
but no, I think that's why I'm saying we need young leadership and term limits. If you have young leadership and term limits, who's bribing you to stay in office for the next 30 years? What corporation? If you must leave office, nobody is bribing you. Nobody's selling. Who are you going to sell your soul to? If you can only serve out 2 terms, maybe you'll just do your job instead and then leave and go back to where you came from.
It's interesting, the power of the banks, because right now we have the FTX implosion that people are still talking about. We're learning more information. And, there are some theories out there, which I've been listening to, and it just has me thinking about the whole system at large, this idea that this crypto wave came in, right? And it's a lot of the ethos is returning the power to the individual, self-sovereignty. And, we need to cut out the banks. Right. So I don't think the banks are too concerned about a movement that's very small, that's worth just a couple billion. But when you get into the tens of billions or the trillions, it threatens their position and their power and their prerogative over money and people's access to it. Right. So how do you see, crypto at large? Because Bitcoiners really, by all accounts, are very skeptical of crypto because it has all these tokens, unregulated Ponzi schemes like we just saw, and they threaten people's financial security, and the average person gets sucked in with Super Bowl ads. But then we also have the banking system that we don't like. And so how do you see these two worlds? Do you see banking as eventually adopting, tokens so that they can somehow make money off of it by custodying it, allowing trading? Or do you see this as a clash and actually removing power from the banks? Do you ever think about that?
Well, I think that what we're seeing with this New York Federal Reserve partnering up with the banks is the banks literally circumventing the entire crypto universe and just keeping custody of money, whether it's physical money in an account or whether it's a digitized money. And the reason I think the biggest banks are all involved together is so that they ensure that together critical mass makes for whatever is going to be digitized.
Yeah.
As opposed to this one, that one, and the other. I don't think it's any coincidence that this announcement from the New York Fed came out today, because this thing's been in the works for a long time. So they were just waiting for a moment. And why not wait for the moment where you hear that 1 million customer accounts were blown up? You know what? We're going to bring the good guys in. We're going to bring the good banks in. They're going to make sure that your money's FDIC insured no matter what form your money takes.
Wow. Yeah, so it's still essentially a cartel from Jekyll Island, huh?
I don't believe in that whole cartel from Jekyll Island thing. Watch out. Sorry. No, no.
But if they're all colluding and working together, how is it, any different than what happens? So
there's absolutely no doubt that the biggest banks need to be let to fail. I'm not speaking out of both sides of my mouth. If they're misbehaving, they need to go. But there is something to be said for the biggest banks in the world today living in China.
Okay, well,
so this is a tacit recognition on the part of our banks that if they do come together, at least in the sense of making sure that there's one digital currency, that at least as a nation, we're not at risk of being taken over by China and their much bigger banks.
Right. And the power that they have in terms of other countries and developing nations saying, oh, if you want this, you're going to need to use the digital yuan. So
is colonization in the history of mankind.
Yep. Okay, to start to kind of wind down, I just had a question on a macro level and then one that's a little bit more personal. Do you think that the last 2 years, when we saw the height of the bubble, the greatest excess before everything started to come down, do you think that was a high watermark in terms of speculation where we will not hit those highs? We won't hit, there are some analysts who say melt up to 6,000 S&P and, I don't know, like Bitcoin would hit 100,000. Do you see that watermark of speculation remaining there for years? Or do you see it as something that we will be able to overcome, especially if the money printer goes burr again?
Well, I think that because Donald J. Trump could not fire Jay Powell, that it's going to be really difficult to get Jay Powell fired for cause, because he did get 80 votes in his Senate confirmation. So barring Jay Powell being taken out mafia style, I don't think that we're going there. I think that this could be a high watermark.
Well, so that means sideways choppy trading, doesn't it? I mean, in terms
Very
of
choppy, especially as
selective stock picking.
The bankruptcy cycle is in motion. Companies are being taken out of the system. Yeah. And that, by definition, makes for chop as one company goes.
And do you believe that we are sort of in this like more commodities-driven cycle and stock picking, as opposed to what we had before, which was like you could basically close your eyes, put your money into equities and indexes, and like boom, it would go up?
So I think that the great big business models of the oligopolies of the world will be really tested in this recession, especially because they're the darlings of passive investing. If the Fed does not ride to the rescue and make sure that whatever it is they're selling, people can keep buying, because that's been the implicit agreement between corporate America and the Federal Reserve. It's that if things get really bad, we'll step in.
Exactly.
That doesn't happen, then the great big we've bought back the value of the entire Russell 2000 in share buybacks. Maybe that gets tested. Maybe somebody actually makes Apple create a phone whose battery lasts. Who knows? They might have to innovate again.
Gosh, it'll be really, really interesting to play out, because we have had a very coddled system. And if I'm being honest about Bitcoin, it has only existed in a QE environment where it has also been coddled by this monetary policy, and it's being tested. Although I am impressed, it's still $16,000 of Bitcoin, but it will continue to get tested more. So where I want to wrap this up is just this idea of hope. For me, I think one of the most beautiful things about the American dream, and what I love about Bitcoin too, is this idea of hope that that our future can be better with hard work, with a system that's more fair. There is hope. So, what gives you the most hope that the future will be better for your kids than maybe it feels like it is today?
Natalie, it's talking to people like you. It's seeing people who are from younger generations who recognize the value system that made this country great. As long as you and people like you spread the message and proliferate that there's something good to be had from integrity, good work, going to sleep at night exhausted, and passing that work ethic along to your children, as long as you continues to grow, that's what gives me hope. Because I'm like people like boomer, and I'm like my mom, actually, just the same. The hope for tomorrow is not in somebody my age, it's in somebody your age and in my kids.
I love that. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate your kind words, and you have made it such an impression on me. I love following you. I also love your fashion when you speak.
Thank you.
I'm a girl.
All about the shoes.
I really do appreciate it. And it gives me so much hope that I have a chance to talk to people like you and share your message with more people. So thank you so, so much, Danielle. Where can people find you?
So come to Quill Intelligence. We're crazy, stupid, cheap, $60 a month, and you can get the best, most agnostic, least sell side research in existence. And follow me at DiMartino Booth, and come follow my YouTube channel, because I do what you do all the time as well.
Yeah, I follow it. I hope everyone does. I've loved this discussion. I love the takeaway message too. There are too few workhorses in this economy and too many show ponies. Okay. We need more workhorses. We need people to work. So thanks, Danielle. We'll see you soon. And we're going to keep trying to orange pill you so that you're a Bitcoiner.
Keep trying. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much for checking out this show. Again, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any new content. And I love to hear your feedback. Leave a comment or send me an email at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Let me know what you think, if you have guest suggestions, and I'll see you next time.